Ngā minui ki a koutou, tēnei te mihi ki te tangata whenua, te Aotearoa me Taranaki whānui. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to close your session today. And whilst I apologize for not having been here throughout the day, I've got my spy here, my personal spy, Bridget McLellan, who has reported on the proceedings of today. So I've got a bit of an idea as to how you discussed how to break through the politics and actually get the science truly reflected in policy and in transformative change. And I'll be talking a bit about our climate journey. And one of the benefits of being a representative of a bloc of 27 countries is that we are by nature bipartisan, because there are elections every year in one or the other country, which means that the decisions that are taken at 25 are valid for a much longer time than the legislative cycle in other countries, and in particular in the very limited legislative cycle of 3 years that is the case here in New Zealand. So I arrived towards the end of 2019, which is when the new Commission leadership or European Union leadership took office, with the promise of establishing the European Green Deal, which would make Europe the first climate neutral continent in the world by 2050. Now, 2019, 1st of December, Commission President von der Leyen started her term. She is the first female Commission President, so that was already quite exciting. Mother of 7, former German defense minister, and doctor by training. And what did she have to tackle in her first years in office? A pandemic and a war. And I'll speak about how this disrupted or was expected to disrupt our climate trajectory, but actually did the exact opposite. What happened over the last 3.5 years has only strengthened our resolve, and I'll be able to prove that. So I've structured my intervention according to the 3 themes you were discussing today: mitigation, adaptation, and opportunities, and we'll run through that. And if anything isn't clear or too jargony, please do not hesitate to interrupt me. So I've already spoken about the Green Deal, world's first climate neutral continent by 2050, our man on the moon moment, where we would give back more than we take, and in a way that ensures no one is left behind. And how would we achieve that? Through a dedicated and comprehensive roadmap, a transformative strategy to reconcile the economy with our planet, to reconcile the way we produce and the way we consume with our planet, and to make it work for all our people. We forged on throughout COVID, not only with our big package, which we called Fit for 55, which is one of the interim targets when it comes to our greenhouse gas emissions reduction, notably 55% by 2030. And this is not just a target, but is reflected in a host of policy measures and legislative acts that are being adopted as we speak. And I'll come to the most recent package in a little while. Review of our ETS. So sounds familiar. So something we've worked on for quite a while, and maybe I can already highlight one of the outcomes of this ETS review and this reform of the ETS, and that is the creation of a social climate fund that redistributes revenues of the ETS to energy and transport poor people. So we are giving money back to the member states that identify those people that can't afford the transition in transport or in energy, in order to allow for a just transition. But that's just one element, so ETS. There's also the farm to fork strategy, looking at making food systems fair, healthy, sustainable, and resilient. We've got our biodiversity strategy, the plan to protect nature and reverse the degradation of ecosystems. And you will see, despite all the wonderful things we do and the leadership we are showing, the politics are coming through from time to time. And I don't know how closely you're following European discussions, but we had proposed the first ever nature restoration law, which recognized that 80% of Europe's land was degraded and would have to be restored, with a target of 30% restoration over the next couple of years, re-wetting peatlands, for example, all of this. And this is something that has been caught up in politics. So let's see, its fate hangs a bit in the balance. Just to say, whilst we've got many answers for many questions that are still up in the air here, and we've got a broad consensus on carbon neutrality and on the need to reduce drastically our emissions, there's still the one or other things that aren't fully agreed. So COVID actually strengthened our resolve, is what I said, and that is testified by the fact that towards the end of COVID, we took up together as 27 common debt to finance the recovery, the COVID recovery, distributed according to the impact that COVID had on the individual economies, and of which 40% of this debt that we took on, in total more than 1.8 trillion euros, so more than 3 trillion New Zealand dollars, 40% of this had to be spent in a way that it fought climate change. So mainstreaming of climate change objectives, and this is not only for this recovery fund, but that's the case for our entire budget. One of the outcomes or direct deliverables of the European Green Deal is whether it's research, whether it's development cooperation, whether it's agricultural policy, at least 3 in 10 euros have to go for climate action, and that has to be evidenced whenever this money is spent. So end of 2020, climate ambition stepped up even further. I already mentioned the 55% by 2030 compared to emissions reduction compared to 1990. And that is enshrined in law, so our first ever constitutional climate law. And as I said, you can't repeal that easily. The way the European system works, it's tedious, it's difficult often to come to a consensus, but once it's agreed, it's there, and you can't walk away from it. So we've made an irreversible legal obligation for all our member states to reduce their emissions. And in doing so, we've set ourselves the task of achieving in just 9 years, so from 21 to 30, more than what we have achieved over the last 3 decades. But we've done it because tackling this climate crisis starts and ends with emissions reductions. Massive emissions reductions if we are to stay below 1.5 degrees of global warming. And we've just received the advice from the equivalent of your climate commission as to what the target for 2040 should be. And we'll propose that beginning of next year, the advice is we should go for 90% emissions reductions by 2040. So that'll be a challenge, even with all the steps we've made. The war. 16 months ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. That happened, of course, during the peak of the EU's dependence on Russian gas. The energy we had chosen as transitional energy source, moving from coal to renewables. Energy and food prices shot through the roof, and many citizens worried about how they would keep fed and warm. The summer of 22 did nothing to lighten the mood. It brought nature and with it the economy to its knees. Transport corridors shut down for lack of inland navigation water, and domestic energy production shut down for lack of cooling water and lack of hydro water. At some point, we had more than half of the nuclear power plants in France out of order because there wasn't enough water levels in the cooling rivers. Wildfires raged throughout the EU, and severe droughts heavily impacted our agricultural yields at a time when global food insecurity was heightened by the loss of Ukraine's crop production. And yet, we've not changed our course. We're not giving up on our Green Deal. In fact, we're doubling down, we are accelerating. And I can, of course, tell you that, and that's my job as an ambassador, but if the Economist says that, and you will be able to find an article in The Economist that actually calculated that the war has accelerated the green transition in Europe by 10 years. Simply because we didn't have an alternative. We had to get rid of Russian fossil fuels much, much quicker than we would have otherwise, and accelerate the rollout of renewables. So diversification of suppliers, reduction of consumption, and this is also something very remarkable, that because of this fear of not having enough energy and to keep the lights on, we reduced our energy consumption by 15% across Europe. And this is also enshrined in law. So coming up to the next winter, if one member state doesn't manage to reduce their consumption, then there is the legal obligation to shut down industries in order to meet this reduction target. Just for lack of choice, really. This is the situation we're in, so the war has forced us to become much faster. And this, of course, coupled with the doubling of the rollout of our renewables infrastructure, simplification of the permit for wind and solar, and rollout of heat pumps. Now, which creates all kinds of other challenges that you are all too familiar with in New Zealand. Where do you find the people that actually install all these beautiful heat pumps, let alone sourcing the heat pumps? So this comes back then to economic security issues. How do we get our own economy to produce all these products that we need for renewables? But that, I'm digressing, I'm not just hinting at that. So fast forwarding our energy transition, reducing our dependence on Russian fossil fuels, and speeding up our renewables rollout. We've also recently raised our binding renewables capacity target for 2030 to 42.5%, with ambition to reach 45%, which would almost double the existing share of renewable energy in the EU. And what really surprised us when looking at the figures around this acceleration of our energy transition is that we would only need to invest 5% more than we planned to wean ourselves off Russian fossil fuels and meet our 2030 climate and energy targets. Earlier, I said that our Green Deal aims to reconcile our production and our consumption patterns with our planet. The EU accounts for roughly 8% of global emissions. That leaves, of course, historical emissions aside, but I don't want to open up another can of worms. But our consumption impacts emissions beyond our own borders. As a bloc of 450 million discerning consumers, we are very much aware that we've got a carbon footprint also through our consumption offshore, outside of the European Union, and that we can influence production patterns in other countries through our trade and our financial patterns. So we've also adopted a host of legislative acts to address our consumption outside of or climate footprint outside of the EU. I'm not going into the detail, I'll just mention them. Happy to provide any more detail if you're interested. So we've got a deforestation regulation that guarantees that products placed on our market no longer contribute to deforestation or forest degradation worldwide on the basis of satellite pictures. Quite fascinating the way this is done. We are also finalizing a corporate sustainability due diligence directive that will make companies within its scope. We're looking at bigger companies, obviously, not the two-person SME that exports or imports, accountable for human rights and environmental violations along their value chains. And that will include both EU-based companies and companies operating in the EU. And then we've just proposed our green claims directives that will ensure all marketed products containing green claims are backed up by evidence. And then we've got something that you, I'm sure, will be aware of, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that will help reduce the risk of carbon leakage stemming from our green ambitions, basically creating a level playing field for the highest polluters by setting a by setting an adjustment mechanism that kicks in when these products are entering the EU market. So, but we know that all this has an impact on countries exporting into the EU, and they are not all high-income countries, which means that not only are we in discussions and try to involve and inform about our legislative intentions, but we are also providing assistance to help, in particular, developing country partners leapfrog. So we've got just energy transition partnerships with a number of countries, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and most recently Senegal, and we are the world's largest climate finance donor. So when looking at the $100 billion pledge under the Paris Agreement, the EU and its member states, we like to describe ourselves as Team Europe, so the EU, that's Brussels, and the 27 member states combined are making up almost 1/3 of this pledge of the 100 billion climate finance. And in a world where there are heightened geopolitical tensions, we also need to reconcile trade openness with security, and would, of course, like to trade with partners with whom we can be stronger together, not more vulnerable. And this is not necessarily onshoring, but rather falls into the discussion of friendshoring. I think everybody is really keen on in making our supply chains more resilient and working with partners we share values and ambition. So one wonderful example that falls into my term here is, of course, the conclusion of negotiations of the FTA between the EU and New Zealand that has got the most ambitious ever trade and sustainable development chapter, which includes the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement as one of the essential elements of the agreement. And it includes a consultation process with civil society. So that is baked into all our trade agreements. We've got so-called domestic advisory groups that we will consult regularly on the impact of the FTA, and also to invite them to share concerns. So much for mitigation. I'll move quickly, realizing that I'm going way over time. Adaptation. Adaptation is, of course, also part of our climate change policy and of the Green Deal, and all the more urgent for Europe because, according to a report published only last week, Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world, 2.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels last year, and we've already broken temperature records yet again this year before summer has even begun. So we recognize that we need to be better prepared, and we've set out what we need to do to adapt faster, be more systemic, and also be smart about that in our EU adaptation strategy, where we are mainstreaming, once again, climate resilience and adaptation into all relevant policy fields at all levels. And that also means stepping up our international action for climate resilience because climate change knows no borders. This is also where climate finance comes in, and this is also where the taxonomy, the EU's taxonomy, plays an important role in directing investment streams. And you know so much more about this than me, Sebastian, but so just to flag that here. And this is also where the nature restoration law comes in that we all hope will be adopted shortly. So, opportunities to conclude. I think you've discussed a lot today the existential threats to the world and for us Europeans caused by climate change and environmental degradation, but they're also an opportunity for us to do better, an opportunity and really just without alternative to live healthier, greener, and more sustainable lives. And in this, research and innovation have and will play, of course, a central role in modernizing and reorienting the EU's economy and society towards a just and sustainable future. We've got the world's largest research, development, and innovation program in the world, Horizon Europe. That's got a budget of 170 billion New Zealand dollars over 7 years. And that facilitates collaboration between public and private partners to foster new technologies, sustainable solutions, and disruptive innovation. And once again, as with all our expenditure, more than 35% of that budget is dedicated to addressing climate change. And it already has funded a range of research and innovation projects relating to climate change over the past couple of years, including electric ferry development, sustainable rare earth extraction processes, improved heat transfer systems, supporting green cities, flood risk data collection, and circular waste. But what is very exciting, and again, not thanks to me, but coincidentally while I'm here, maybe a bit thanks to me as well, that New Zealand researchers will now have the opportunity to apply for Horizon Europe funding in collaboration with European partners, because we are about to sign the association agreement of New Zealand as the first non-European country outside of our neighborhood to Horizon Europe. Already previously, New Zealand researchers and entities could participate, but now they're participating on a par with Europeans. That means New Zealand universities can lead a consortium, can put it together. You need two partners, among which Europeans, so you can build on. I know there's a lot of ongoing research cooperation between New Zealand and European universities, but the difference is now there is funding secured for the New Zealand participation that has been adopted in the budget last month, in the New Zealand budget. So great news, very excited about this, and we hear from academics also that there's a lot of interest and excitement about these new opportunities to research global challenges, including in the climate, energy, agriculture, and environment space. Research, of course, also plays a key role in our policy development, and normally I wouldn't have closed this, but Caroline, my head of trade and an eminent climate expert that some of you may have met, Caroline Lambert, she concluded last year's event, but she's moved on to take care of research feeding much closer into policies, and she's now heading a team of researchers at the European Union's Joint Research Center in Spain, working on circular economy and sustainable industry. And this Joint Research Center is part of the EU, it's part of the EU institutions, and provides our leaders with independent evidence-based knowledge and science at multiple stages of the policy cycle. I already mentioned that, just like New Zealand has the Climate Change Commission, we have the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change that evaluates our policies and identifies actions and opportunities to achieve our climate targets. And again, if you have a bipartisan approach, and if you've got 27 countries that need to take a decision, they are even more relying on independent scientific advice to help shape policy decisions. So yeah, they've recently given their advice on the 2040 targets, and several of our member states also have their own independent advisory bodies with representatives from academia, civil society, the private sector, and public bodies. Yeah, I think it's maybe a bit presumptuous from me now to conclude and to turn into the future, because you will have concluded all throughout the day what needs to be done, and I've only had the opportunity to listen to some of your ideas at the very end of this. Of course, we need to make the voice of research much stronger, of research and reason, and help that it is disrupted the least possible by politics and politicking, because we know the science is there, as it has been for decades. We've got a lot of the technologies that are needed to actually decarbonize, and the difficulty is and has been for quite some while organizing and financing the deployment at scale, whilst decoupling their deployment from unsustainable resource consumption. So while science or research for policy needs to look at technical or hard science, in the coming decades, we equally need to focus on humanities, economics, and governance together if we are to succeed with transformative change. So beyond growth is what we're looking at, and what will feed more and more into our policy processes in the future. Ngā mi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much.